in a slightly unusual position in this session because we have two papers and then two participants who have yet to produce the papers. So I think we'll start with the bits we know about, Mark's paper and then Eve's, and then move on to the excitement of discovering what Melissa and Samir are going to tell us. And I start that way around because, Mark, I think you're setting the scene by really doing something which you haven't done yet in the past 2 days. We've more or less been taking it for granted, but explaining why any mythology to suggest that China is just about to implode and doesn't matter and we don't need to worry about all these issues is just that. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, and greetings from Shanghai. I'm just going to try and share my screen here. I don't know if you guys can see that. Here we go. President Xi just recently, at the end of last year, said that China, is in a position to double its per capita GDP by 2035, and that means going from the roughly $10,000 we are today to $20,000 US over the next 15 years, and that would essentially allow China to attain high income status. And the implication there is that China would have average annual GDP growth of just under 5% per year for the next 15 years. So for China to escape from this middle income trap, there are really three risks that analysts stress. First of all, China must ensure that its debt load is sustainable. It must manage demographic challenges, and it must prevent productivity from stagnating. So what I want to do is I want to talk to these risks, and I want to sort of talk to these risks by situating China against the other major economies. So let's start by looking at indebtedness. Here is a graph of China's total indebtedness. That is to say, the indebtedness of non-financial corporations, households, and the government, all expressed as a percentage of GDP. And since the financial crisis, there have basically been four phases of indebtedness. There has been a rise in indebtedness due to the counter-cyclical plan that they had to fight the crisis. Then there's been financial liberalization, the rise of the shadow banking system. Then the government got concerned about indebtedness, and they pursued a policy of deleveraging. And you can see in this period here, the debt of the non-financial sector actually declined slightly as a percentage of GDP. Then we had the pandemic, debt increased again, and now we have a deleveraging phase 2. So when we look at, that was the history, where does China sort of stack up among the other major economies? Here's a graph that shows China's, again, total debt to GDP as a percent, total debt to GDP ratio compared to the other G20 countries. And you can see that China is the seventh most indebted seventh most indebted country between the US and Korea. So clearly China's debt is not off the charts. But if you look at the ranking of the countries from the most indebted to the least indebted, you can see that the emerging market countries are all not as indebted as the advanced countries. So we can say, well, is China too indebted for its level of income? And I think the answer is no. China's debt sustainability is supported by a very large and diversified industrial base. China has the ability to borrow in renminbi. It doesn't suffer from original sin like many other emerging market countries. Its debt is held domestically. Almost all of its debt is held domestically. And of course, China is an international creditor, which makes it more secure. One of the areas of the debt that is the most concern currently is the debt incurred by the property developers. We call this the gray rhino. Everybody knows it's a problem, but up until recently, not much has been done. I estimate the debt of the property developers at about 41 trillion renminbi, about 40% of GDP, about a quarter of all non-financial corporate debt outstanding. It poses a financial stability risk. You can see from this pie chart here that most of the debt is held by the trust companies, then the banks, and then the bond markets here. So we're seeing the developers go under a lot of stress right now, and that's really policy induced. The government came up with guidelines for borrowing, and the companies are having some difficulty complying with those guidelines at the present moment. So that was debt. Now I want to talk about demographics. So the UN projects that the working age population, which we're calling here the population 15 to 59, will decline by 23% between 2020 and 2050. That's a decline of just under 1% per year. Now, if you take that decline in the labor force and you put it through standard economic models, that suggests that would shave off growth of about 0.5% a year over the next 30 years. So China is really not alone in undergoing such demographic challenges. This graph here shows the working age population as a percentage of the total population. Again, it's all the G20 countries. The light blue lines, or the light red line here, is 2020. The darker lines are 2050. So you can see that China is approaching its demographic decline from a relatively favorable position. It has the third highest share of working age population to total population among the G7. However, by 2050, its ranking will fall to the seventh weakest. So China is undergoing a large transition. It's not alone there. Also, Korea and Italy are having similar demographic transitions. Now, there are tools that China has to manage this demographic decline. The first of these is raising the retirement age. Here we have the population in thousands. The dark line here is the population 15 to 59. The light blue line is the population 15 to 64. So these folks are 5 years older. If you sort of phased in an increase in the retirement age by just 5 years, then the decline in the working age population would be 10% rather than the 23% fall we see in the working age population. So that basically cuts your problem in half. Another tool that China has to manage demographic decline is by increasing the educational attainment of its working age population. So they just conducted the major census in China, and they determined that the average age of schooling is 9.9 years, and that was up from 9.1 years in 2010. So they're increasing educational attainment in China. So let's assume that by 2050, China is able to reach educational attainment of 12.2 years. That's where Korea is today. In comparison, Germany is 14.2, and Canada, Switzerland, and the US are 13.4. So it's not a huge step for them. So putting that again through standard models, that would make the average worker 23% more productive than they are today. And that increase in education would fully offset the decline in the working age population. So the 14th five-year plan emphasizes innovation. It's something this panel's been talking about throughout the morning, for me at least. The investment rate is high in China. Hard to know how much more you can achieve through higher investment. There's already been a rapid increase in debt. The working age population is shrinking. So increasing productivity seems to be the most rational way for the economy to develop. So innovation is hard to measure, like how innovative is China? It's very hard to measure. What we have here is a graph of the Bloomberg Innovation Index. And what we're doing is we're graphing the index, the scoring here on the horizontal axis by per capita GDP. And we can see that in general, as countries get richer, they are more innovative, but not fully. Here is China ranks 16th out of the 60 countries covered by Bloomberg. It ranks between Ireland and Norway, which are actually much richer than China. So it's a good outcome for China. Now, I want to just quickly mention a couple of the areas in which China seems to be at the forefront of innovation. The first of these is a digital currency. Probably not going to be will not be the first country to roll out a digital currency, but it has these huge pilot projects going on. 21 million personal and 4 million corporate digital wallets downloaded, and so on and so forth. And we expect a major rollout during the Winter Olympics. Another area where China is at the forefront is 5G. So, just in summary, the difference between 4G and 5G is that 5G allows a conversation. So 4G is basically conversation between human beings, whereas 5G is conversation between human beings and machine and machine and machine. So it's really a whole step up in digital communications. So at the end of last year, China had installed close to 700,000 5G base stations, and that compares to only 50,000 in the US. China plans to put it 2.5 million by 2023. So it will clearly have the largest 5G network in the world. A third aspect. So if you ask Xi Jinping, what is the greatest representative of China's independent innovation, he would say it's high-speed rail. High-speed rail, China's history with high-speed rail started that it would import the models and the parts from other countries, but this is something that over the years China has made its own. Now most of the high-speed supply chain is made in China. So those are the successes that China has. How can China do better? Let's return now to that Bloomberg Innovation Index. Here are the 7 different categories that make up the Bloomberg Index. This is the overall rank, and this is China's ranking within the different subcategories. So China does well on patent filings. It ranks 3rd out of the 60 countries. It does well on high-tech density. It does well on spending on R&D. Where it does less well is on research concentration and productivity. So let's look at those areas. Now, we think of China, the workshop of the world, we think it as being a manufacturing giant, but it isn't really very productive. So here, if we look at this table here, we can see that the value added of the Chinese manufacturing sector is 60% bigger than that of the US. However, it takes China 3 times as many workers to produce that value added. So basically, China's productivity in terms of value added per worker is only half as large as the US. And that's why Mr. Miao Wei, a former Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, said that China is at least 30 years away from achieving its goal of becoming a strong manufacturing power. In terms of researchers, so this is a graph here of spending, R&D spending as a percent of GDP on the horizontal axis, and then researchers per 1,000 people on the vertical axis. And you can see that there's a relationship here. There's a positive relationship. Here, China spends over 2% of GDP on R&D, which is a huge number. I mean, it's very good. It's basically where the OECD average is. But it's engaging much less researchers. And in fact, it should be engaging about 5 times as many researchers given its spending on R&D. So that means that R&D money is pretty concentrated on a small number of researchers. So let me conclude. China's debt has risen very rapidly, but it is clearly not off of the charts. The authorities have made deleveraging a priority, but certain shocks like the virus have knocked them off of course. The debt to GDP ratio should stabilize. There's a lot of risk around the property developers' debt, but the government is taking steps that should reinforce financial stability. China is not unique among major economies in facing a problem of an aging population. It has the advantage of a strong demographic starting point, and it has options to offset the impact of falling labor supply on GDP growth. Finally, China's ability to double its per capita income by 2035 will be closely tied to its ability to innovate and maintain high productivity growth. Experience with high-speed rail shows that innovation can proceed through continuous improvement as well as groundbreaking innovation. So that is my presentation, and happy to discuss.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. So now let's, against that background of the reminder that China is likely to remain and indeed increase its visibility as a major economic power, one of the 2 great economic powers, and moreover likely to be a highly and increasingly innovative and productive one. Let's ask Yves to remind us also of what has come out of the previous conversations, that we have a very big digital governance gap, and then move on to outline, Yves, your very interesting suggestions, many of which have not been previously talked about, for addressing that governance gap.
Great. Thank you very much, Oliver, and thank you, Rohinton, for bringing me here. It's a pleasure. I'm very, very honored joining this very distinguished group, and many of you know more about all the different sectors of digital governance than I do. I also want to acknowledge here the paper was written with Danielle Luo and Panthea Pumalek, who are now on the call, and of course can answer all the more difficult questions while I'll do the easier ones. And they have been working in this field, actually doing indicators and all this for over a year now. So we're having fun trying to measure governance gaps by sectors, etc. And of course, this presentation, which is big picture, is building on several points made by, going back to Kevin Rudd, but also Bob Fay, Dan Surak, and Doug Leopold, and John Zeisman, etc. So I think there's a lot of echoes with what was said. But I'll emphasize the big points first and then focus on some of the findings that we had in our paper. First, this is a paper that emphasizes global existential gaps in the governance of the digital world, including AI. And those governance gaps are actually global, something common for humanity. The paper includes the review of almost 24 books written by leading thinkers in technology, AI, digital science, as well as science philosophers, historians, and political scientists, all those looking at the long term and the big picture, as well as economists. And I'm struck that a lot of non-political scientists and non-public policy people, scientists and long-term thinkers, some of whom are often quoted by Bill Gates or by Elon Musk, actually all conclude, they all converge to say that we are on the cusp of something exceptional for humanity, incredible potential. But they all say also that there's incredible risk in the moment where we are today. And they all call for governance and for increasing human capacity to manage it. And it's also striking that several of them, some of the leading corporate leaders are also building a massive space programs at the same time. And there's a hint in some of the works by some major thinkers that it's almost a backup plan if things really go wrong down here on humanity. So it's partly to show how high the risks are. The next point is that we all know about the incredible array of advances that are happening from e-commerce, social media, communication, home management, work, healthcare, education, transport, entertainment, etc. Everything is suddenly being transformed. There's almost no element of human life that's not being transformed with new potential. Yet at the same time, and that's really paradoxical, and it's important to really realize this, at the same time as we have this extraordinary potential, we see an explosion of social anger. There is, on social media, more anger, congratulations, polarization, tribal politics, and an explosion of conspiracies, as well as security-driven decoupling and the move toward a tech war. So all this is happening at the same time at very, very high speed. And so essentially what's emerging from this broad literature is we have a very big gap between the exponential acceleration of technology and connectivity on the one hand, and human capacity to manage these trends on the other hand. That gap, when it comes to AI, becomes existential. So the few writers who are thinking long-term on AI, and one of them, for example, Toby Ord on existential risks, but the others, he's building his own arguments on other writers who are more scientists. So they argue that, especially Toby Ord putting that number, that the risk of on the line with human values, generalized AI or AGI, is the greatest systemic risk facing humanity, even greater than, he says, nuclear war or even climate, because some humans will survive those risks, whereas the risk of on-the-line AGI will not be survivable by anybody. And he says the risk is 10% of human extinction within 100 years. And that's the highest risk, in that book, that well-known book by Toby Ord. Yuval Harari and Daniel Kahneman, two great thinkers of the current age, were in a conversation recently, and they were both agreeing, coming from those very, very different perspectives, that the stakes for human governance were higher than ever, particularly in AI. They were discussing AI, and that humanity, unlike in previous industrial revolutions, did not have much of a runway to make mistakes. That is, they were arguing that in previous industrial revolutions, we made mistakes and we had wars as a result. This time, if we go to war, we risk destruction. We don't have that chance anymore. So we have to get it right faster than we did in the past. So the next big point is in our paper is that it's urgent to mobilize a multi-level, flexible, competitive regulatory space to generate solutions at a faster pace than we're doing now. And since, in a way, the security, decoupling has left the barn and is too far out, and there's too deep, security risk between China and the West, it's going to have to go around this and include multiple levels. Some of it will be national, some of it will be club level, democracy-based level, and some of which will have to be at the global level. At least allowing for coexistence and some level of understanding. One additional point here, the big picture, is that the free flow of data and access to AI are in opposition to each other. It's like the idea in the past that complete democracy and complete free markets were completely equal or compatible. We have discovered later that free market led later to crisis and eventually to IMF agreements, which would override democracy, right? So we know there are deep issues here. But in this case, data is owned by a few big firms, and it's a huge winner-take-all advantage because those who have data can go very, very fast with AI and sweep all the gains. And so to have a true democratic agreement, the way John was calling for, actually would require regulations that would be quite far-reaching and data sharing agreements to make sure that everyone has even playing ground on the AI battle. Because if the data battle is not on even playing ground, then the AI competition is not on even playing ground. And so that precludes a deep agreement even between EU and US at that level. And as pointed by Dan Surak, there is a huge competition over technological rents, and AI suffers from that more than anything. So those are a few big introductory points. Now, in terms of more specific points, in our paper, we review some indicators on the speed of the explosion of the digital age. I'm not going to emphasize this now. The AI economy today is estimated at $50 billion, which is tiny relative to what's coming. Soon it's going to be trillions. And there was a sharp rise in 2020. In our second section, we give 8 reasons why addressing the digital governance gap is critical. And what's complicated is all 8 things are happening at the same time. So it's very hard to address one of them and think that the others can be ignored or held constant, right? In a way, we have to work on all 8 at the same time. So the first one is the old Williamson-Norris issue that markets needs institutions. And here we're facing an exploding market that is under-institutionalized and under-regulated, and it affects trust and accountability and sustainability of the market. The second is the fact that we have unprecedented power of digital companies. And so that reminds us actually at an even greater scale of earlier phases during industrial revolutions. And we discussed that yesterday. But a few people in a few companies end up also deciding who gets to speak in political discourses at home. So now when you think of it, the staffers in Facebook, and it's a small unit of Facebook, and by the 85% of that unit focuses on the US and 15% on the rest of the world. So that's a very small amount of money and people. They are the ones who decide this can go forward, this has to be blocked. And so they hold a control over political discourse in all democracies around the world. And that's remarkable and has never been seen before. And it's unregulated and it's unsustainable. And by the way, Facebook has only capacity in 50 languages. And so there are many, many places like, say, Solomon Island, where there was an explosion of hatred a couple of years ago, was out of the radar screen of that control mechanism. And so that's enormous. The vacuum of governance is something that has never been seen before at that level. Third, we have the risk of explosive social disruptions and inequality. And here I would again point to Yuval Harari and his Homo Deus book, where he says, 5 to 10% of the people will be empowered and enabled to become Homo Deus, but 90% will be Homo useless. And we're going to a bipolar humanity that is, of course, not going to be accepted, and therefore will lead to social explosion. Already, we are in a highly unequal society. AI and digital, technologies are accelerating this. Our social systems are not adapted. Essentially, we have to remake all welfare systems, and the tax base is eroding everywhere. And the new agreement, the 15% tax agreement, is not enough to deal with it. Fourth, we have global systemic risks. We have more and more interconnections, digital currencies, algorithms, et cetera, and as in finance 20 years ago, we don't have a global safety net yet. So where is the global safety net? This is something urgent. Fifth, the loss of privacy and potential loss of human freedom is staggering. So yes, there's the rise of surveillance states at the extreme form, in China, and that's something that's scary to everyone else. But it's also arising in a concentrated private form in the rest of the world. Francis Fukuyama last night was making a speech about it at Stanford. The amount of data that's controlled by each of us by very few companies, like Google, is staggering. And if put in the wrong hands or captured by anyone, would have absolutely devastating outcomes. Six, we have a democratic existential crisis. And I think for anyone, any Democrat, any pro-democracy person, the most scary event of the last few years was not anything that came from China. It was January 6th, where essentially a few, 15,000 people driven, it turns out a lot of them driven by beliefs in QAnon. It was up to 40% apparently. That's complete conspiracy created on social media, were mobilized for violence, right? And so think of what could escalate, and there's no agreement in the US on regulating this. And finding any way to make sure that 2024 doesn't have this at the level 2, right, or at the power 2. So anyone watching this in Canada, it's pretty scared. And by the way, you hear similar stories of extreme polarization, which by some indices is the worst in US history since the Civil War. But you find similar stories in Korea, in many countries where, essentially social media is driving polarization and anger. This is amplified by something deeper. And Peter Reiner here at UBC in psychoanalysis has written, and many others, on the concept of extended mind, where it's found that we humans are increasingly delegating part of our thinking to apps and to smartphones, where we essentially say, oh, I don't need to think this, I'll take that, I trust this source, or this Twitter feed, or this and that. And those are more and more polarized, and they're driven by algorithms for private interest and for private profit. And so it's driving us apart. 7, cybercrime, cyber piracy, cyber attacks. I'll just say Ron Deibert, Nicole Pelroth. This is how they tell me the world ends. All those things are real in front of us. And 8, finally, fragmentation of the internet into rival spheres and weaponization of interdependence. The decoupling is real and is accelerating, but we are in a weird situation where we have a completely integrated global economy. Digital is at the heart of it. And we have regulatory processes that are decoupling very fast for security reasons. So this is not an equilibrium, right? And what's scary about decoupling is that it's abrupt, it's driven by fear and by security dilemmas, and it's not negotiated because it's driven by fear, right? And so the tit-for-tat measures are hard to contain. So in our next part in the paper, we measure the global digital governance gap by sections. After reviewing the G20 outcomes, I just went through the 3 paragraph in the G20 Rome Declaration, and it's terrifying by its emptiness and vacuousness. But in our table, we divide certain components. We measure internet governance, data governance. We give good numbers there, 8 out of 10 for internet, 6 out of 10 for data governance because of rules, but although they're fragmented. On digital trade, with the degree of innovation in trade agreements and conversions there, but no global level, we still give it 5 out of 10. Cybersecurity, we give it a 3 out of 10, lack of binding rules. On misinformation regulation, violence regulation, we give it a 2 because of absence, and it's driven by the absence of regulation in the US, which is a systemic risk, right, for the rest of the world, because the US controls Facebook and controls Twitter. Mobile payments, we gave it a 3 out of 10 because it's fragmented. On AI, there's a complete vacuum, so it's 2 out of 10, except ethics guidelines. Taxation, we give it a 4 because of progress, but it's a long, long way, and I'm not sure it will be ratified in the US, that 15% level. On monopoly regulation, we give it a 2 out of 10 because of lack of global rules. On hardware, chips, etc., 5G, we give it a 1 because of a bifurcation and essentially a security reality. So we divide actually the approaches in the world in 4 boxes, not 3, because we have a China model, an EU model, a US model, and an India model. And India, I think, emphasizes data localization, the government roles in the government role in data, and there's a lot of regulations that went through this year, including on social media and all this, giving a role for the government in controlling and having the right to take things down, right? Even on Twitter and Facebook. There's infant industry protection and the demand for space for developing countries. And what's driving India is, again, the AI dilemma, right? The first mover advantage and the winner take all problems. And so that's what deadlocked the G20 in 2019 in Osaka. It was India plus Indonesia plus South Africa that refused to sign on the data free flow with trust. Because they don't want to be left behind, right? And if they don't have access to data, they can't have an AI economy. So in conclusion, our proposal, but before I get to the final proposal, we're saying there's a huge disconnect between technological development, the scale of existential risks, and the degree of securitization on the one hand, and the supply of governance and human capacity on the other hand. The stakes are huge. The digital gap is real, it's existential, it's shared by all of humanity. Political leaders are not yet incentivized to deal with this. They're distracted by short-term urgencies and competition. I agree with the digital Bretton Woods proposal by Rohinton and Taylor. The problem is how to accelerate and make it. Probably has to come from many sectors, many actors. Human solutions will have to come from multiple sources. We need something like the NDC bottom-up competition in climate, where everyone, has to come up with, from their perspective, with what can increase human governance capacity to deal with those 8 problems. The G20 needs a complete elevated working group working on common issues. I agree as well with John, however, that the US EU will have to deal with some of the toughest issues, because if they can't deal with them, no one will be able to. But it's hard because the EU has very little leverage. The US companies have all the leverage, and basically it requires the US to accept tying its own hands or the hands of its own companies, despite having a dominant position and given the rent situation. And that's not easy. That reminds me of the GMO negotiation, transatlantic negotiation in the 1990s. That didn't work. There was a compromise on the table that looked reasonable, but it required the US regulating its own companies by forcing them to take mandatory labeling. Then the EU would have accepted everything else. But due to regulatory capture in the US, there was no way that the US regulators would accept mandatory labeling that was opposed by their own companies. So something of that sort will be, there will be tough deadlocks between US and EU. And at the top level, global and US-China level, there has to be coexistence talks and guardrails and arms control talk, essentially, something like the 1960s. But we have to remember that the 1960s arms control talk that became very real, that even worked for the Antarctica or space and all this. All this came after the Cuban Missile Crisis, after everybody got terrified. And I don't know if we will get to the right level of coexistence talks until we have a major crisis that will terrify all of us, right? A major risk of war. So those are the thoughts from from a political scientist looking at the big picture, but not as attuned with all the ground level that many of you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Yves. Well, on that happy note, let's move over to Melissa. And discover what you want to contribute to this.
That was a great conversation, Yves. Thank you so much. I guess I'm going to bring maybe a slightly different perspective of this based on the different I guess conversations and engagements I've had with China and watching things evolve. And as the session is what lies ahead for global relationships in the digital era, I think it's really important that what's driving the digital era is the globalization of the security issues. We have the technology has enabled cyber crime at unprecedented levels, of which ransomware is holding all of our hospitals hostage and our corporations and our major critical infrastructures. We have surveillance at an unprecedented level, whether it's conducted by our corporations for monetization or it's conducted by our governments. We have disinformation that's undermining our democracies and actually preventing us from actually saving ourselves from a health and safety crisis and of the information on the vaccinations or the vaccines authenticity and efficacy. We have the emergence of digital authoritarianism, again, at unprecedented levels, even in democracies. The exploitation of data by companies and corporations and governments, and then espionage and intellectual property theft. So it's no wonder that there's a fear factor because our digital economy and this digitization that is at, as one of our colleagues said, 26%. And I'd love to see the UNCTAD data around that because the United States is only measuring it at 7%. And so we don't have a common measure of effectiveness of the digital economy, but nonetheless, the digitization and our economic issues are now national security issues. And as was presented in the Xi Biden summit last night, the US was accused of abusing national security to oppress Chinese companies. But I would argue that whether it's the United States, China, or Europe, all of our countries are abusing a national security definition defined very broadly to limit market access and really become more protective in what we all perceive as important. And that has to be said out loud. And we need to start to recognize this because it's breaking down the transatlantic partnership. It's breaking down the democracies. And it's creating significant barriers and competing standards that are slowing down the uptake of technology based on the geography or the flag that it wears. It's increasing costs by our corporations and the tariffs and the taxes that we're imposing based on the national champions. And it's diminishing our interoperability. So therefore, it's a tax on the digital economy that we have to recognize significantly. Now, right now, I think that there is significant leverage being held by China as the large market, maybe the largest market, and the global dependency on being able to sell goods there. And so this is where the clash of interests becomes really significant. And I'll focus part of my discussion based on the United States and what we kind of perceive as some of the challenges going forward. I've been in part of a negotiation for the last 3 years that is supposed to be discussing how to keep these open global technology supply chains, how to keep them open, and they are increasingly closing. How do we ensure the free flow of data with trust? And I could argue that there are too many countries that are actually closing the free flow of data through data localization, national champions, digital taxes, et cetera. How do we guarantee the level playing field of technology companies, of capital movement and entrepreneurs? And we are increasingly closing those aspects and then allowing technology firms to operate and innovate globally. And we are closing those market accesses, the digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act in Europe. There are now 5 laws in China that are continuing to close market access, and then many of the other restrictions that we're opposing through export controls and the like. So how do we start to think about this, and when did this sort of emerge? So market access is the key to what we're all worried about on national security, but really on economic issues. And market access has been a long-standing challenge for the real barriers of entry to any business, foreign business, into our domestic markets. And so you see this regionalization from Europe, you see it from US, and you see it from China. And it's the expansion of export controls for businesses, research institutions, private organizations, et cetera, that are being placed on these either white lists or black lists. And this goes to the Bloomberg article I posted earlier on the white list, or the preferential treatment of companies in China. But we are also having the unreliable entity list of the catalog of technologies that are prohibited from export. And it's funny, in China, they actually updated that emerging technologies export control list in August of 2020. And there were 23 critical technologies added to their protection of intellectual property to enhance their national security. And it generally mirrors a list that the United States published literally a month and a half later. But in it, it has, key technologies on genetic engineering, on machine tools, space technology, quantum technology, space remote sensing, information countermeasure technology, and the like. But the Americans, we published it on the 15th of October in 2020 with 20 critical technologies that included advanced computing, advanced engineering materials, advanced sensing, autonomous systems, semiconductors and microelectronics, and the like. So we have a list of emerging technologies that we're going to prohibit from export, because it helps lead to either the innovation and enhancement of the digital economy, and it could be misappropriated to enable these activities that we don't appreciate, whether it's disinformation, et cetera, the cybercrime, the surveillance, and the like. Continuing on the market access line, we then are very cognizant of China's 14th five-year plan that talks about elevation of China's self-reliance in technology, that they're going to decouple on microelectronics, on semiconductors and integrated circuits. And that may have been induced by some of the challenges that the United States perceived, but they added artificial intelligence, gene technology, quantum computing, cryptocurrencies, or this national digital currency, central bank digital currency, the exploration of space, deep sea, and polar regions that really lead into the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been around for now nearly almost a decade. That they're working on their technological growth over speed and becoming a global leader in innovation, which also coincides with the theft of intellectual property from many of the developed countries that we cannot ignore, but is not part of the current dialogue, the front and center dialogue, that intellectual property theft has not diminished, going against the research and development of our key universities and our key corporations to advance the interests of the state-owned enterprises and the state economy of China. Then if you start to take and build on that, and you look at what's going on for market access in China, our companies, all of our foreign companies of the developed world, are worried about the censorship. You've seen a fair amount of US companies actually exit in the last 3 weeks out of China over some of their different laws, whether it's censorship, the complicated licensing, the joint venture requirements, the negative list, which is about foreign investment where investors are not allowed to hold more than 50% equity in the interests of the companies. And there's many sectors that are off limits to foreign investment. Actually, the majority of the sectors are off limits. And then the overall foreign investment law. But what I'm struck most about what's happening now and the laws that have recently passed, or the culmination of multiple laws coming together, is the declaration that data is a national asset. And if you go to the points that were made earlier this evening or yesterday, that in order to feed the algorithms, you must have data. And if I can make data as a national asset, and therefore it is my sovereign jurisdiction, then I actually can feed my algorithms and perfect my algorithms. And so I get to more of this algorithmic warfare, which I think is going to be emerging as one of the key components of the digital economy. It's restricting data flows, it's reducing trade, it's slowing productivity, and it's increasing price for the affected industries. And it builds from the cybersecurity law that was passed and became effective in June of 2017, that had more than 79 clauses in it that had maintaining network security, protecting the rights and interests of individuals, that later was published in the PIPL law. It includes data localization, regulated technology transfer, no notice inspection of key corporations, and allows the government, Chinese government, more space to request and control information. This was followed by the data security law and the critical information infrastructure security protection regulations that gave identified as part of the data security law, key national security and economic lifelines, where so many companies and or key market areas were identified as national security interests, to where the different types of data to the national economy, national security, and public interest would be regulated. And then the critical information infrastructure security regulations identify the different operators across, again, multiple different sectors, that allows the government to request more control over the information, again, leading to data as a national asset. And then finally, the personal information protection law, intended to come in line more with the general data protection regulation of Europe, that would allow them to have more free flow of data and commerce with Europe, is paving the way for more detailed requirements by the regulators to, quote unquote, protect individuals, society, and national security from harms stemming from the misuse of information, getting to the core of social stability. So when you start to take into account that data has become a national asset, as declared by one of the key economies that everybody wants to do business with, you have to have a strategic pause of what are the interests for your own digital economy, for the future of algorithmic warfare and the like. And you have to start to get to, how can you counter that? Well, so some of the reactions that you're seeing from countering it, in my opinion, start to get to the discussion of, the Quad and the D+10, and the Quad Senior Cyber Group of that just assembled in the end of September, was to adopt and implement shared cyber standards, secure software, a workforce for talent, working groups that are going to look at research for AI and advanced communications to try to counter the 5G. The transatlantic cooperation is also necessary for these critical and emerging technologies, and that Trade and Technology Council that met just after the Quad, just a few days later, established 10 working groups on technology standards, secure supply chains, ICTS security and competitiveness, data governance and tech platform regulation, misuse of technology that threatens security and human rights. But that threatening the human and security rights, I'll go back to last night's Xi and Biden, that thou shalt not meddle in my domestic affairs, and I do not want to hear about what I'm doing domestically on human rights and the like, then becomes this, this wolf warrior diplomacy that we're seeing, that large market, that global dependency on the PRC market being held as leverage against Australia or the Canada or the United States or elsewhere of thou shalt not actually dispute what's going on domestically, and I will penalize you economically if you were to actually say something outward and public. And so these are some of the challenges that we face as we're going forward on this national security versus our national economic welfare. I'll just kind of conclude with the Belt and Road Initiative is important to recognize. It's been underway for more than a decade, and China will actively promote international cooperation through its BRI. It has more than 100 countries that are now dependent upon it as its trading partner. And they intend to achieve policy, infrastructure, trade, financial, and people-to-people connectivity that builds a new platform for international cooperation and create new drivers for development. And this should not be underestimated. And when you look at the analysis of where they have invested, how many of the key strategic lines of communication, sea lines of communication, the key areas of trade that they have now have mostly complete control over, they have nibbled like the silkworm and could swallow like the whale. And in the United States, we see the BRI poses significant challenges to US interests and has the potential to displace our companies and many of the Western companies from the BRI countries, and will set the technology standards that will be incompatible with US products or our Western products and push countries to align more closely with China. We see this as an existential challenge for the democratic or the like-minded nations. And so when I look at this as the clash of interests, this is what's driving the challenges between when I get to the road ahead for global relationships in the digital era. We're at a battleground of what the United Nations Secretary Gutierrez would say is we're at the risk of a looming risk of the world splitting into two, with the United States and China creating rival internets, currency, trade, and financial rules, and their own zero-sum geopolitical military strategies that are going to force everybody to choose. Thank you.
Thank you. We come now finally to you, Samir. It'll be very interesting to hear your commentary on that.
Let me just, okay, I'm unmuted and I'm in a small developing country called Germany. And so the internet is a little patchy. After having lived in India for so long, I'm struggling with the German speeds, the broadband speed. Sometimes they drop off, I'll try to log back in. But I think everything that needed to be said has been said. Between Melissa, Eve, and Mark, I guess we've had an overview of Chinese progress, the big flashpoints in our digital lives. And I think Melissa has, in some ways, in a concluding few minutes, posed the challenge for all of us. And I'm going to take that a little further. Let me try and flip this around. If I was to suggest that actually China has posed us 5 challenges. In fact, the Chinese have asked us the future of digital international relations. They've asked us 5 questions and they want us to respond to it. And it is us who are unable to respond to very clear, lucid Chinese propositions. And we are pretending to ignore it, and we are still trying to find ease of doing business rather than responding to the politics of the digital business that the Chinese have placed on the table. So I think, first of all, let us try to understand what the Chinese are saying. The Chinese are saying that in 1997, we created the first decoupling in the digital age. It was called the Chinese firewall. In 2021, we have created the nth decoupling when we have stripped our companies of their valuations who were relying on American capital markets. So the Chinese have progressively decoupled, and yet we are trying to find ways of not wanting to decouple. They already have. It is you who is struggling with accepting the fact that we had a system where they saw you as a landscape to benefit from without having to reciprocate. So I think, first of all, the decoupling agenda that people warn us about is nonsense. It has always been there since the inception of a global internet. We have always had firewalls and different kind of regulatory walls. The Europeans have joined the fun more recently with the GDPR. The Indians will join with their own version of the data protection bill very soon. And we will all have our own firewalls. Are we willing to create a strategic architecture out of these gates that we are building, or are we going to have these largely at the national level? And if we have them at the largely national level, then as Melissa suggests, the sheer size of the Chinese market and its attractiveness and its and the dependence of over 100 economies on trade with China, on investments from China, will eventually move the needle and shift the architecture of the future digital world towards the Chinese design. I think that's a very simple question the Chinese have asked. Do we have it in us to put together something which is attractive and robust to respond to the digital Silk Road that the Chinese have been perfecting over the last 2 decades? This is not a new happening. This happened from the day the internet was born. I think that's the first point I wanted to leave. The second was, I am also seeing that if we talk about global relations as the session tries to engage on, I find something really curious. I find that the first principles of international relations have been breached, and none of us have responded to it. The idea that we will have embassies in each other's countries was to have representatives in your geographies to explain to you about your interests, your businesses, your peoples, your cultures. Now, what has happened in the digital age? The Chinese have embassies in all our countries, and they don't allow us reciprocity. They use Facebook and Twitter and social media, and they engage with our public sphere. They enter into our political debates, wolf warriors and sniping and instigating and playing on cleavages that Eve mentioned, sometimes even creating synthetic cleavages where none existed, sometimes riding on QAnon, sometimes creating the QAnon, depending on which geography you work on. The Chinese are gaming our public sphere, and they don't allow you reciprocity and presence in their public sphere. And I think this is the first principle that we need to respond to as a world. Are we going to continue to allow unilateral access to China of our digital lives, even as they deny us entry into theirs? And I think this is a fundamental question we need to worry about. And the reason I raise this is because for the last few weeks, I've been really worried. 2024 is a very big year. 2024 is the first time in the digital age that the US and India will both go into elections. We have big elections coming in 2024. We have highly precarious and polarized democracies in both these continent and subcontinent. And this is an ideal, I mean, if you thought that we had some kindergarten Russian interference in 2016, wait till you see what happens in 2024. The next 2 years are going to be really choppy, really, really loud, and really, really noisy in both our countries, Melissa, US as well as India. So, tighten your seatbelt. We are going for a nice 2-year-long ride. The democratic ride, largely on the digital domain, with many international actors gaming our internal political conversations. And I think this is very important, this reciprocity. That's the second question. How are we going to create a digital architecture that tells the Chinese handles to bugger off unless we are allowed reciprocity in their public spheres? And I think this is something we need to be thinking about. It's not about censorship. It's about doing to them what they do to us. I think if they want to prevent us from participating, I think we need to come up with an architecture that it results in the same for them as well. The third, of course, is something that Mark alluded to. I think previous panels have also discussed. Melissa mentioned the stealing of intellectual property, etc. And I think this comes from the deep, at the core of certainly the Chinese political toolkit, but also more recently, in some sense, encouraged by Chairman Xi, when the idea that you can borrow the boats to cross the river has become really important. They are going to use your institutions to achieve their political ends. That is something that is a stated objective. They are going to take over the Cambridges and the Oxfords and get their research units to innovate for China. They are going to go and take over the Economist and FT and New York Times and Washington Post and make them part of their propaganda. You have enough evidence that tells you how much money is moving into these institutions from the Chinese treasury, and we are pretending to be blind. We don't want to respond to them because it is not convenient. We are making a few $1 million as think tanks, as institutions, as universities, and all of us are happy. All of us are making money in the Chinese game. So no one wants to confront the hard Chinese question, can I buy you? And our answer seems to be yes. So they wanted to borrow a boat. We are willing to sell all our boats to the Chinese. So the second question is that, are we going to protect the institutions that define the liberal order, that define the Bretton Woods Rohington that you were mentioning, that define the multilateral system that many of us now only remember from the last century because it doesn't exist today? Are we going to defend those institutions, or are those institutions for auction? And the digital age is that period of our evolution as societies where they are under severe and real threat. And I think that's the second point I wanted to make for you. The third, of course, is, again, I think the previous speakers touched upon it. Melissa especially mentioned the Quad. And I was asked by some colleagues in Australia, what should be the Quad agenda? And I remember that I said, you guys have already spoken about it. All roads lead to, I mean, when you tell the world, let's go digital, you basically mean, let's go to China, because they control the rare earth, they control all the components and all the manufactured outputs that many of these countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America require to go digital. Today, all digital roads lead to Beijing. And unless the Europeans, Americans, Indians, and others get together and create alternative manufacturing capacities, the processing capabilities, fabrication units, and the workforces that the previous speaker was mentioning, we are continuously going to rely on Beijing to deliver for our digital aspirations. And I think, therefore, the third question Beijing has proposed to you, do you have it in you to build an alternative or a diversified value chain, supply chain, manufacturing chain, and certainly the digital chain? And in that sense, I think that's something we need to think about, because this is going to implicate the future of the countries and their digital importance in geostrategic affairs. I mean, for example, Congo could become the new big hub for giving you the most important critical minerals for the fourth industrial revolution. Australia, of course, has a large percentage of the mix, but you're going to see new geographies emerge, new flashpoints emerge, new ports are going to become more significant. Malacca may become redundant. You might have another flashpoint in a different part of the world. The geopolitics is going to follow the movement of these critical minerals, and we have to see where they are. And we have to start thinking about security, national security, international relations, multilateral institutions, global financing, global investments in this context. And unless we follow these minerals that are going to define the next 80 years, the Chinese are doing it already. And I think we need to start responding to it. Otherwise, you're going to see a lopsided international landscape emerge. And the fourth and final point, I think, is that we are also sitting in a moment when we have a little bit of a tragedy. We have the world's most innovative economy, most incompetent in regulating it, and that's the United States of America. The most innovative economy has basically surrendered to the private sector, has forgotten how to regulate and use the stick. They only believe in carrots and incentives. They don't know how to beat the shit out of the bad corporates. Standard Oil was an example. I keep reminding my friends that, you know, we had the similar images of Standard Oil as you now have of Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Standard Oil was taken to task. Now, does American regulation have the capacity to set a new template and a benchmark for managing big tech? Because unless they do it, the big tech companies are running amok all over the world. And, you know, Eve was talking about Facebook, but Facebook is only tip of the needle. There are many companies which are not that popular, but are doing far more dangerous work, from facial recognition to intrusion into your personal spaces to hacking into your devices. We are seeing private sector tech become absolutely unregulated and enjoy protection of many articles of our constitutions, which have allowed innovation to move in a certain direction. And I think unless the liberal world, the democratic world, understands the importance of sensible regulation, we are always going to be an unattractive proposition, or rather we are going to be an amoral or certainly an unethical proposition for many others, and that is going to be a bad position to negotiate the Chinese challenge from. And my last point would be that, of course, I think none of this, I do not want to imply for a moment that I do not see China as the most important partner for each one of us in the future. I think the Chinese will have to be part of any future order that emerges. The only, my only plea, my only input is that that conversation with China on the future order should happen from a position of strength, not a position of weakness. I think the diversification of supply chain means that China can be a very important part of the supply chain, but will not have the ability to weaponize it. The ability to have different sources of minerals and rare earth would mean that we don't give China a veto over our digital growth. The importance of ensuring that there is reciprocity in participating in our public spheres means that we will ensure good behavior by certain actors rather than leave ourselves vulnerable to their perverse actions. So none of this suggests that it has to be excluding China. All of this means that I think we have not really responded to the Chinese propositions, and perhaps you know, like my former Indian foreign secretary said once, that if Pakistan is an army that has a state, China is a party that has a state. The Communist Party of China is having a free run because we are not responding to these central political questions that the digital world needs to respond to. So I'll end there because I believe the time is also up, Rohinton. So I'll close there.
Well, thank you very much, Samir. Yes, I think we have actually reached the end of our proceedings. And I think rather than continuing the discussion at this point, we've had two very lively final contributions that after the very interesting discussions from Mark and Eve, and there's a great deal to think about that's emerged from the final quartet. Which reflects on everything that went before, but also goes even wider. I think we should simply thank everybody who's participated in what has now been a very long session, or rather a very long combination of 3 sessions. And thank you also to all those who contributed, many of them still around today, to yesterday's session. It'll be a devil of a job trying to bring together and summarize all the contributions from the conference as a whole, but I shall attempt in due course to do that, and thank you all very, very much indeed. Rohin, I think you should probably close the proceedings.
Well, thank you. No, look, I mean, closing involves not summarizing happily, but we look forward to all your papers. I reflect, Oliver, on what we set out to do. And I think the collection of discussion and papers will be an authoritative statement of what the state of the world is. Not agreement on everything, but the sort of diversity and depth of views that exist have sort of come out in these 2 days. And I look forward to 2 things. One is to see your papers in final form. If you're happy with the ones you've sent in, then that's great. If you want to sharpen anything because of something you heard at this meeting, please do so within 2 weeks. And if we don't hear from you, except for the 1 or 2 people who have not submitted papers yet, we will post what we have from you. The other thing I should say, and Oliver, I'll turn it back to you on this note, is that the point of the overall project for peaceful competition is to engage with China at 2nd and 3rd levels. And how you do that with our friends and colleagues in officialdom and at Fudan University is going to be something that's going to animate the kinds of points that have been made here, fundamentals of understandings and misunderstandings of what drive China. And I'd be very interested to see how you and your colleagues, Oliver, take this forward and what peaceful competition ultimately looks like.
We'll all be very interested. This is not a project that can engender peaceful competition. It can merely discuss it and produce some interesting ideas about how to promote it. But it will be very interesting indeed to see what kinds of responses come from Chinese colleagues in due course. As Melissa and Samir were reminding us, there are some big issues that lie behind this. But as Samir closed by saying, in the end, somehow or other, China and the rest of the world have to live together, or otherwise we'll die together. How we achieve that is the great question of which this conference has been addressing a fractional, but nevertheless extraordinarily important part. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, each and every one of you, and see you soon.